Hello, this is Aaron Wren, and thank you for joining. There have been some very interesting developments in a Christian denomination called the Christian Reformed Church. I say interesting because these are not the kind of developments we normally see in denominations, and you'll find out what I mean by that. And today I have an expert here to talk to us about it, and that's Paul VanderKlay. Perhaps I should say the Reverend Paul VanderKlay, as he is a pastor in the Christian Reformed Church denomination in, I believe, Sacramento, California. And he's also a prolific YouTuber, and there's tremendous content on a wide range of subjects on his channel. He's very thoughtful on the CRC, but also Jordan Peterson. You name it, he's talked about it. And so there's a link to his YouTube channel in the show notes for this. You can check it out. So, Paul, thank you for joining.
It's my pleasure to be here, Aaron.
Most of my audience is probably unfamiliar with the CRC, the Christian Reformed Church. So, just very briefly, what is the CRC?
The Christian Reformed Church has its roots as a Dutch Calvinist immigrant denomination that split off from the Reformed Church in America, which is the oldest Protestant denomination in North America. Came over with the Dutch in the colonial days. The Christian Reformed Church had its roots in a couple of split off groups in the Netherlands. And then when they came to America, they found the Reformed Church of America a little too American. And so they wanted to maintain Dutch language. They were against Masonic. They were against secret societies like the Masons. They very much wanted to preserve their Dutch ways. And so they really grew in immigration before the First World War and have always sort of been next to the Reformed Church of America, but been more self-consciously reformed and a little bit more tied to their Dutch roots than, let's say, the Reformed Church of America, which had been here quite a bit longer.
How many people approximately are in the denomination?
I think current numbers are a little less than 250,000, about 1,000 churches in the United States and Canada.
Okay, so it's a little smaller than, say, the Presbyterian Church in America, which is in the
Yeah.
300,000s, but similar size there. And where is this church geographically concentrated?
They've concentrated mostly in areas that Dutch immigrants settled in. And then after the Second World War, kind of spread out to other major American cities and metropolitan areas. Western Michigan is sort of the base. You have other subsets in Northwest Iowa, and then some dying colonies in some of the other areas like northern New Jersey, where I grew up.
So, what percentage of the people who are in the CRC today come from predominantly Dutch ancestry?
That's a real hard question. My guess would be somewhere around 80%, 80 to 85% would have Dutch last names.
Yeah, I sort of think of it as almost like a quasi-mainline denomination and somewhat similar to the Lutherans and being a little bit of a quasi-ethnic denomination and also one that has a lot of institutions from K-12 education, colleges, seminaries, all wrapped up in the denomination. Is that a fair way to think about it? Or
if there's a Lutheran denomination that we're similar to, it would probably be mostly the Missouri Synod Lutherans.
Mm-hmm.
So the Christian Reformed Church has looked mainline from the outside, mostly because people recognize, especially Calvin College, Calvin University. That's usually what people see. But basically what's been happening in the Christian Reformed Church since the end of the Second World War is that it's been assimilating into the broader American ecclesiastical framework. And so in the Christian Reformed Church, there's been this division between those who tend to look to the main line as, oh, that's who we'd like to be, and those who look to the evangelicals as that's who they'd like to be. And so over the last 70 years, it's been in that process of assimilating much more towards other North American churches.
And just to make sure people don't get lost when we start throwing around lingo having to do with the CRC, I want to briefly talk about the governance structure. So let me tell you what I think it is, and then you can correct me on that. It basically has a Presbyterian form of governance. So it's very similar to the Presbyterian church, in that you have local churches that are governed by a board of elders made up of lay elders and the pastors called a council, I believe. It'd be the equivalent of a session in a Presbyterian church. There's a higher level structure, typically geographic, of churches called classis, which would be similar to a presbytery in a Presbyterian church, or think of it as a diocese. And the key here to Presbyterian governance, meaning it's essentially ruled by committee. You wouldn't think of it that way, but it's instead of a bishop, you have a committee, and then essentially above the classes, you have the synod, which is essentially an annual meeting in which all the classes come together to make denomination-wide policy. Is that basically correct?
That's close enough.
Okay.
There are 3 assemblies that govern the church. So actually, elders and the pastors would be the consistory, but in most churches, it's the council. They include the deacons, and then the classis, and there is usually a little governing committee. In the Christian Reformed Church, the classis and the synod actually only have instantiation during their meetings. They have little subcommittees, but they're always accountable to the annual or quarterly meeting.
Presumably, it's somewhat bureaucratic. I mean, Presbyterian church is the most bureaucratic form of church governance that I know.
Yeah. Although my father, part of what's kept the Christian Reformed Church from a lot of that is because of its ethnic roots. Many people in the Christian Reformed Church are blood related. And so up until really quite recently, it was a very high trust denomination. And so when my father, for example, after he retired, there was a local Presbyterian church that wanted him to basically do interim pastoring for them. He was shocked at the amount of bureaucracy that was in that Presbyterian group as compared to what he had lived with in the Christian Reformed Church. So it has been a fairly high trust, which has kept the bureaucracy to a minimum.
Okay, so with that kind of the basics out of the way, my impression of the CRC is that it was a denomination that was trending liberal. And this is basically for 2 reasons. One is that the CRC approved women's ordination. So I'm not sure exactly when that happened. It was a product of a lot of debate. And then after that, a group of more conservative churches split off to form a denomination called the URC. And splits like that leave the remaining denomination more liberal, almost by definition. For those of you who know Kevin DeYoung, who's very well known in evangelical circles, he used to be in the CRC. He was a minister in the CRC.
He was a minister in the RCA.
Yes. And second is that the flagship denominational college, Calvin University, has been trending very left with no apparent pushback that I've seen. And then 2-3 years ago, a church in Grand Rapids or East Grand Rapids called Kneeland Avenue Christian Reformed Church installed a deacon who was in a lesbian relationship. And this is very typical of left-wing vanguard moves. So by that, I mean leftist groups often take unilateral action, sometimes in contravention of the rules or the law, in order to establish facts on the ground and then essentially dare people to stop them. So, for example, that's what Gavin Newsom did when he was mayor of San Francisco. He started unilaterally issuing marriage licenses for gay couples, and that ultimately led to the Obergefell decision that legalized gay marriage nationwide. So this is often a very highly effective tactic, and one reason is because organizations, denominations, etc., often are divided into sort of 3 camps: the kind of the liberal, moderate, and conservative. And the moderates typically don't have the stomach for the kind of bare-knuckled conflict it has to roll back these vanguard actions. So that often does work. But that does not seem to have been the case here. So maybe you could fill us in on what happened with this Kneeland Avenue CRC situation and how it has played out in terms of the denomination.
So as you in the mid 90s, the Christian Reformed Church allowed what they called a local option for women's ordination. And what that meant was that local councils could allow women to be ordained as deacon or elder. They could at some point call a woman minister. Those people wouldn't be seated at classis, the next level up, until classis agreed. And once a majority of classes sat women, deacons, and elders, then synod would seat them. And that happened, I believe, in 2004. So before the Second World War, the Christian Reformed Church, like many other ethnic denominations in North America, was a fairly insular, fairly conservative denomination whose main job was to try to preserve its cultural and doctrinal distinctiveness that it took over from the Netherlands. In fact, from the Netherlands when it left, not as the Netherlands continued to evolve. After the Second World War, as with many denominations, across the denomination, young men had to go to war. They were rubbing shoulders with other soldiers. The Christian Reformed Church didn't seem like God's chosen people the way it had been before the Second World War. And you had this, in many ways, it sort of follows the neo-evangelical developments that you saw in Billy Graham, in the broader evangelical culture. And when the counterculture hits, it sort of tacks along with Billy Graham and many other broadly neo-evangelicals in sort of a slow accommodation to the changes in American life. And in the 1970s, there was obviously a big push across the board for women's ordination. And also in the 1970s, a move towards gay liberation, let's say, a re-evaluating of the church's traditional position with respect to same-sex marriage. So the Women in Church Office wars began in the CRC in the 1970s and ended in the 1990s. Basically, in the 1990s, the church, in many ways, in exhaustion, found that it could not use its traditional way of dealing with this, which was have a group of elite theologians from the denomination study the issue, come to a definitive answer based on the word of God, and deliver it to the denomination for the denomination to follow. Basically, what they had was a number of study reports that said this matter of women's ordination is difficult. We don't really know if we should prohibit them completely. And so out of exhaustion, the denomination basically says, we'll let local churches and local classes decide. And once the majority decides that it's permissible or okay, they'll go. We'll do it. Obviously, there was a group of around 60,000 members who left out of protest of this, but also Genesis issues. Again, in terms of the broader trajectory, this is part of the assimilation into the broader American church experience. These issues were out there in broader evangelicalism. Evangelicals were dividing around them. You still see the Southern Baptists fighting about women's ordination. And so the Christian Reformed Church had maybe 20, 25% mainline-ish, and maybe 80% moderate and conservatives. And the moderates could basically, in time, go along with women's ordination. Important to keep in mind with this is the fact that the Christian Reformed Church reaches its numeric height, 350,000 members in the mid-90s. A lot of it sort of driven up by the baby boom. After the Second World War, there was a significant, I always say to people, churches leak left and break right, okay? While everybody sees the break right over women in office from the URC, what has been invisible all along in the denomination has been the left leaking. In other words, the deconstruction that we've seen going on broadly in society, where young people don't see the relevance of church, don't see the necessity of church, maybe abandon some traditional beliefs, maybe sort of believe there's a God, but God loves us and church attendance isn't that important as long as I do good things and my heart's in the right place, and maybe I believe in Jesus in my heart privately or something like that. Those groups tend to leak left. And so while there was a break right in the 90s, there's been a continual leak left in the Christian Reformed Church as well. And the churches that fought the Women in Church Office wars often were urban Christian Reformed churches that had been planted after the Second World War in places like New York metropolitan area, San Francisco Bay, Southern California. These churches fought that fight. What happened between the 1990s and the 2020s has been the place I grew up in New Jersey in the 1960s and 70s had more than a dozen thriving Christian Reformed churches. Now there are 3 or 4 significant ones with people with a lot of Dutch last names and a lot of smaller ethnic church plants that have joined the denomination. Similar thing, San Francisco, when I got here 25 years ago, number of thriving churches in the Bay Area. Many of those people either have left the faith, left the denomination, gone mainline, or sold their homes in the Bay Area, retired in Grand Rapids. Similar things in Southern California. What's been happening is that where the Christian Reformed Church basically decided we're not going to fight over women in office anymore. Basically, the denomination said, if you're complementarian, you're good. If you're egalitarian, you're good. And we're not going to fight it anymore. Over this time, there have been a number of study committees that dealt with the issue. In 1973, a major report basically said, people often don't choose their sexual orientation. What they have to decide to do with it is what they will be held accountable for. Therefore, if you find yourself with a same-sex orientation, you can be a member of the church. There's no problem as long as you don't act on it. And that's been the position of the Christian Reformed Church since 1973. Since then, there have been a number of attempts to try to get the church to update that position. At each attempt, the church has been turned down. What we've seen happening over the last 10 years, though, is that the church has actually been growing more conservative. And part of this is because of, also after the civil rights movement, like the church I grew up in, my father's church that he planted in Paterson, New Jersey, mostly African-American church. The church I pastor here, majority African-American church. Most of the leadership is African-American. These were basically racial reconciliation churches that in the 60s and 70s said the church needs to bear witness to racial reconciliation, and churches did that. That tended to be the progressive wing of the church. That progressive wing tended to have dominance in the establishment. And so CRC progressives tended to be at Calvin College, Calvin University, in denominational offices. And then ever since the civil rights movement, there's been a steady beat of we need to be a more diverse church. Now, this was both in terms of theologically, we believe that, that all human beings are God's creatures, regardless of race. We denounce racism. Also, because there's no more Dutch immigrants, and because the Dutchmen in America have been very successful, and they've had smaller children, and those who have been successful in terms of academics and higher degrees have tended to leak left, the Christian Reformed Church said, we need to grow among Asians, Hispanics, and African Americans in order to stay viable as a denomination. The Reformed Church of America did the exact same thing. And so over the last 30 years, the Christian Reformed Church has been trying to grow amid other ethnic groups. Now, to many, that looked like a progressive move because racial reconciliation sounds like a progressive move. Many of the people who came into the denomination from Hispanic backgrounds, Asian backgrounds, about 10% of the Christian Reformed Church is now Korean immigrants. Those folks, generally speaking, are conservative with respect to issues around human sexuality. So the progressives who have held the establishment have sort of been losing body weight behind the scenes and losing churches. The moderates have sort of held their own, but the conservatives have been growing. And they've been growing partly due to as bringing in perhaps some people who have left mainline churches. That's sort of been the overall evangelical move for the last number of years. But also ethnic minorities, Koreans came and saw, another distinctively reformed, self-consciously reformed denomination, conservative denomination, we're in. And the Christian Reformed Church used a lot of its financial resources to try to attract these groups, give scholarships, help with finances, the way denominations usually try to grow outside themselves, and were to a degree successful. So then suddenly after Obergefell and all of the changes with respect to same-sex marriage, many in the establishment and the progressive side of the denomination said, this is just like women in office. But the church was not like the church was in the 1980s and 1990s. Mm-hmm. It's less Dutch. And then also the progressives increasingly look, whereas before they were saying things like, we're all part of the body of Christ. But now these establishment progressives are saying, our children and grandchildren aren't going to church, and there's no way they're going to go to church unless we basically follow with the predominant prevailing cultural trends of saying, total inclusion. And that sort of ratcheted up the tension. But I've been watching the language over a number of these issues over the last 15 years, and it's been fairly obvious that the church has been getting more conservative, and conservatives have been having more power in synods and classes around the denomination. And what really happened in 2022 and even in 2016, when they established a committee to study this again, because the progressives kept saying, we need to restudy homosexuality. And in 2016, Synod said, yes, but everyone on the committee is going to be in agreement with our position. We're going to exclude people who are not in agreement. Progressives had a fit, but they didn't have the votes. Then after the pandemic, the report finally came to Synod 2022. And again, the conservatives, the moderates sided with the conservatives, and the progressives are now in a real fix because they have been the establishment. The denomination has always sort of followed them and looked up to them. And now they're realizing they're maybe 20 to 30% of the denomination, and they're not going to have the votes, and they're probably never going to have the votes.
So basically what happened was they did a report, the denomination did a report, and this report affirmed the traditional position on human sexuality. And then essentially, my understanding is they wrote it into the confessional documents, essentially saying our confession, when it says this, this, and this, it means this. Sort of an interpretation, sort of written into the governing docs, if you will. Or is that
that's the progressive interpretation of what happened in 22. Okay. I think a truer interpretation is that this is what the documents always said.
Okay. Well, that's what I mean. It's sort of like an opinion, a judicial opinion on the here's what the law actually means.
Yeah, this is what the position of the church has been, and this is why the church has believed this. And so if you want to change the mind of the church, you're going to have to justify it. But again, as you said before, a lot of people assumed, well, we can sort of change the church because the moderates won't have the stomach to actually discipline and enforce this. And this is, in fact, why the Reformed Church of America has been splitting up over the last couple of years, because partly because of their structure, they couldn't enforce it. And moderates and conservatives couldn't discipline those churches that were stepping out from denominational guidelines.
Now, before we get onto this Kneeland Avenue situation again, I want to highlight something and talk a little bit more about this idea that the church, the CRC, has been growing more conservative as it's become more ethnically diverse and as it's sort of the younger generation is more conservative than the older generation. So you essentially have old baby boomer, progressive, establishment, denominational position type people who are apparently very heavily concentrated in East Grand Rapids. They're much farther to the left than the next generation, the younger generations, and then these ethnic groups. That strikes me as completely the opposite of the Presbyterian Church in America, where the younger people, and maybe, I don't know exactly what their positions would be on sexuality. They're certainly much more liberal on gender issues, I would say. And culturally, in many ways, they're definitely to the left of kind of the old, more conservative Southern traditional people in the denomination. There's this view I think that the under 35 crowd in the PCA is far to the left of the baby boomers in the PCA. And you're saying that it's the opposite here, that the older generation is more liberal than the younger generations, in a sense.
Yeah, but now if we imagine that is within families, you get the wrong picture. Part of my argument is that a lot of the children and the grandchildren of the establishment boomers are no longer in the Christian Reformed Church. And
so this is almost like the mainline bleed a little bit here for the more progressive types. They were mainline-ish, and they've suffered the same diminution as a result of demographic atrophy as the PCUSA has.
And so, and what's been happening is that others have been coming in and filling those positions. It's also to the fact that, and I saw this in the 80s when I was in seminary. I remember it didn't serve in the 80s. There was this lament that the brightest and best of the denomination are no longer going into the ministry, which didn't really feel good if you were in seminary. I guess we're not the brightest and the best. But that was the lament then. But you could see where, let's say my grandfather and my father were both Christian Reformed ministers. I think in my father's generation still, he graduated from seminary in 1960. The idea was that if you'd have a really sharp young man in your community, we would really have that person go into the ministry because that was elite status in our community. And what happens as the 20th century continues to progress is that, well, increasingly people aren't going to, say, our denominational college. They want to go to the Ivy League, and anyone can go to Calvin College, but our young man got into Harvard. And so, yeah, you had in the 20th century, boomers tended to assimilate into mainstream culture, but the denomination sort of held itself together by attracting those who weren't necessarily in mainstream culture.
Do you think that there's something different about the way that the CRC did multiracial outreach that attracted a more conservative base? And you know, again, a lot about this. Again, you grew up in multiracial ministry in Paterson, New Jersey. You now essentially pastor an inner city church in Sacramento, I believe, that's very multiracial. Again, if I look at the recent debates in the Southern Baptist Convention over women's ordination, or, can you have a Baptist church that has a female pastor? There was just a group of black pastors who wrote a open letter critiquing this move to become more strict on that. So they represent, I think it's fair to say, a liberalizing faction. They may not be liberal on sexuality issues, but they're more liberal on other issues. But in your denomination, it seems to be the opposite. Did you do something differently in terms of multiracial outreach than others did?
I don't know that we did. I know that because of one stream of thought, you can sort of connect women's ordination with, let's say, same-sex marriage. But I think the issues are quite different. There have been women in leadership in the Salvation Army and Pentecostal churches. You've had female orders in Orthodox and Roman Catholic traditions. A lot of people, whereas when it comes to same-sex marriage, there's nothing like that in the church history. Mm-hmm. So I don't think the issues are necessarily as tied as a lot of people assume they are. I think with some lines of rationality, they are tied in terms of an overall liberationist rationale. But in terms of what really motivates them, I think they're different. I think part of the reason...
theological tools that you use to analyze the situations are quite similar as well. I mean, they
are in some groups, yes.
Certainly from an evangelical perspective, if you adopt a biblical interpretation principle that leads to women's ordination, the same techniques can be used for essentially anything.
Yeah. There certainly is I agree with that.
And again, in a more mainline, they have an entirely different theological approach. And I don't know how the CRC approaches those things, because you have traditional confessions. It's not about just... well, we're going to go consult scripture, but you also have these, long-standing traditions and confessional documents going back hundreds of years.
Right. So that's a layer of interpretation. But with respect to, let's say, would make the Christian Reformed difference from, let's say, the Baptists, many African-American churches are Baptist. You don't find, with respect to, let's say, some African-American Catholic groups, and the African-American population in the Catholic Church is not insubstantial, but the majority of Black churches in America tend to practice believer baptism. Ethnic minorities that look at the Christian Reformed Church, obviously, we're something different from, let's say, a large Black church. And this was true in my father's congregation in New Jersey. It's true in terms of my congregation in Sacramento. Any African-American in my church has a whole range of Black Baptist churches that they can pick from that are far larger, far more monocultural, usually what they grew up in. What it tended to attract other ethnic minorities to the Christian Reformed churches tended to be Heidelberg Catechism. Some of the practices. So I was a missionary in the Dominican Republic, and one of the things that always impressed the Haitians about us was that this Presbyterian form of government, they used to say in the Dominican Republic, no hay jefes en la reformada, which meant we don't have bosses in the Christian Reformed churches. Basically, you'd have these bishop structures, and we had much more of a much more of a Presbyterian form of government,
Right.
and that impressed them. So I think a lot of many Koreans had a Presbyterian background, and so they fit fairly well in the Christian Reformed Church. But many African American and Hispanics who would come into the Christian Reformed Church wanted a denomination that actually had the confessional formulas that we had. And so for that reason, they weren't sort of Black Baptists who said, oh, we can be Southern Baptist, or we can be African Methodist Episcopal, or we can be, whatever.
Well, that's good. What about Kneeland Avenue? So what happened with that church?
So it's helpful to know that, I don't remember how many years ago, almost a similar thing happened in Toronto, where a church in Toronto said to its classis, we would like to ordain an openly practicing gay elder. And that hit the news in the denomination. There were overtures that were sent to Synod. Synod basically told the classis in Toronto, this is out of step with us. You as a classis should admonish your local church not to do it. And the church backed down. Because the church had had all of this talk about this, Classis Grand Rapids East in 2016, as a classis, wrote a document that basically was a justification for the church allowing same-sex marriage in the church. And classis put that up on their website saying, this is our study committee. We disagree with the position of the Christian Reformed Church with respect to this. Nothing happened. Then this deacon in the congregation, she had served 3 terms before, apparently, but now she had married. She was a lesbian, married another woman, and this was during the pandemic that this happened as well. Synod had been called off 2 years in a row because of the pandemic, and then there was a sense of what's happening here. It's one thing to have a conversation about this matter; it's a different thing to act on it. And also what you had a classis that was in favor, or at least not willing to discipline or admonish the local church. Now, the Christian Reformed Church has been watching the Reformed Church of America deal with this for 25 years. The polity of the Reformed Church of America is a little bit different from the Christian Reformed Church. Their synod doesn't have as much power, and the classis has more power in the Reformed Church of America. And there were a number of classes on the East Coast of the United States that had been ordaining openly gay and lesbian clergy for a number of years. And the denomination, similar to the Christian Reformed Church, had been growing by attracting ethnic minorities, by attracting other evangelicals. And so their church, too, had been growing more conservative. But the majority of their denomination didn't have the ability to discipline those classes and get them to stop. And so what happened in the Reformed Church of America when finally the conservatives and the new people had come into the denomination got sick of it, someone else started a breakaway denomination. And so the conservatives left for the breakaway denomination, leaving sort of a rump denomination that's the Reformed Church of America. The Christian Reformed Church has been watching this. Mm-hmm. And knew, on one hand, our polity is a little different. Synod has more power. Basically, if Synod decides to do something, it can really do it. And so Synod 2022 did it. And then Synod 2023 said, a lot of people said, well, the next Synod maybe will undo. Maybe Synod 2022 was an anomaly. Synod 2023 happened, and it was not an anomaly. The denomination has changed, and this will not be permitted. And so those who want to go in that way, those who feel very strongly about having an affirming stand and conviction, it's really uncertain if they're going to have a future in this denomination, because at some point they will be kicked out.
So the synod told this Kneeland Avenue church that they have to back down on their approach.
Synod told Classis Grand Rapids East they need to deal with Kneeland because there's a structure to it.
Right.
So basically, Synod is loath to sort of jump over the Classis. So they lean on the Classis, but Classis Grand Rapids East has held their line, and a number of the other churches in the Classis have now come out with affirming statements. And so basically, it looks like the majority of that Classis is not going to back down.
Right.
And formerly, I think they just assumed that we'll just wait it out. The culture is going to change, just like women in office. Eventually, everyone will go along with us. What they've seen in the denomination is that it's not changing. They're becoming increasingly a minority in the denomination.
Yeah. So what happens if, I saw the statements from last year, after last year's synod, that Kneeland Avenue is like, well, we're not changing. And then if this Classis Grand Rapids East says, well, we're just not going to do it. Like, what can you actually do? Are there actually any mechanisms? Because again, it's very typical of vanguard action on the left. You do something, you just refuse to back down and say, okay, force me. And then it's like, oh, what do you do? How do you do that? And it becomes like endless legal things, which a lot of people don't have stomach for, to be quite honest. I think the conservatives seem to be much more interested in procedures, following procedures. Maybe that's just because of this biblical literalist kind of thing. They tend to be very interested in the book and the order. It never occurs to them that like other people are just like, we're not going to do that.
Yeah. We've seen that in like the United Methodist Church, where you have bishops who basically openly defy the position of the church and then discipline against people who do comply with the position of the church. That's not Christian Reformed Church culture.
Okay.
And so part of what happened in these two synods is that synods have said, in order to participate in the denomination, to be an office bearer, you need to subscribe. You need to sign the covenant of office bearers that say you subscribe to the three forms of unity, the Heidelberg Catechism, Belgic Confession, Canons of Dort. And you should do so wholeheartedly and in good conscience. And what Synod said is basically, there's no room for holding an affirming position while subscribing to these documents. And so even though there was a motion on the floor to basically have Classis Grand Rapids East lose their seats in Synod 2024, that motion failed, partly because the president of Synod kind of stepped down from the chair. He's a moderate with a lot of authority and persuasion in the denomination. Said they appealed at this synod. They've only now learned of their appeal. It's a little draconian to kick them out 6 months from now. Give them another year. And so that swayed enough moderates to give them another year. But I don't think they can count on that happening in 2024. So if nothing happens, if Classis Grand Rapids East doesn't do something or leave, what everyone expects to happen in Synod 2024 is they will lose their seats at Synod. And what's happening between now and the next Synod is there's going to be more work done on the question of, what does subscription look like? How much can we differ? And if you do differ from the teachings of the church, what then is the process? But the Christian Reformed Church isn't going to be a denomination that just sort of looks the other way on this. That's the culture of the church.
So how do you think this is going to play out with these progressive churches and maybe the Grand Rapids classes? Do they end up leaving the denomination, or what ends up happening? How do you think that will play out? Obviously, you can't fully predict the future here. We're not going to hold you accountable for fully predicting the future, but it's interesting.
A few clergy and churches have left to the left. For some of them, because the Reformed Church of America is very close to us in a lot of different ways, some churches are thinking about, well, maybe we should join the Reformed Church of America. part of what's also in Christian Reformed church culture is a love of institutions. And the institutions of the denomination have been the establishment's baby. You know, this is what they care about. They love Calvin College. They love Calvin University. They love World Renew. They love all of these institutions. I would like to see these churches start a new synod, basically, and then probably leave, start a new synod, and then see what kinds of agreements that they can broker with the current Christian Reformed Church in terms of ways that we can work together with institutions and other things. I think we're also going to see, and this has been coming for a long time, we're also going to see some a reassessment of the stance between the church as organism and these institutions. Evangelical churches usually have all these sort of institutions up there that other churches relate to. The Christian Reformed Church, some of our institutions have sort of been doing that, like World Renew, which is sort of a relief and development organization. So I think we're going to see the continued evolution of those things, which again is along the lines of what we've seen in evangelical spaces overall in the country.
How do you think this is going to affect Calvin University? Because Calvin University is a denominationally owned and controlled college, has definitely been very progressive on these issues, and I believe actually issued a ruling that their faculty don't have to subscribe to the confession on this matter, because they do have, some gay-affirming faculty. I haven't seen any evidence that anybody in the Calvin world is interested in pushing it in a more conservative direction, but how do you see it playing out?
Because the CRC is so family-oriented, these things are going to take a little time, because you're not dealing with a name you read in a magazine. You're dealing with a second cousin. And so there's going to be a pace to this. And that's also a bit of Dutch culture. Dutch culture tends to have a certain degree of tolerance as well. I think long-term, though, I think Calvin has, for the last 15 years, tried to walk a line. They've continued to be technically aligned with the position of the Christian Reformed Church. In many ways, if you look at someone like Preston Sprinkle, that's pretty much where Calvin has lined up. We're gonna give as much latitude as we can in this while holding this line, while not agreeing that same-sex marriage, while not affirming same-sex marriage. And in fact, just last year, there was a sociology professor who performed a same-sex wedding, and their contract was not renewed, and they are now suing the university. So the university has been trying to hold that line. I think actually in the future, the college is going to try and hold some tension with this and not simply break away from the denomination and follow the culture. The reason being that once Calvin, there are other colleges closely tied to the denomination but not owned by it. One is Dordt College in Iowa. Dordt College has been thriving as a conservative alternative. I mean, a college like Hillsdale is thriving as a conservative alternative. If there's nothing distinctive between Calvin and Grand Valley University or the Ivy League schools, Calvin is going to lose its reason for being. I think it's going to see that even though it can no longer count on sort of the Christian Reformed lock-in that will bring students to it, I think it's going to have to try to continue to be a confessing, moderate evangelical college. When I went to Calvin College, probably 75% of the student body was from Christian Reformed churches. Today, it's less than half. And so Calvin, over the last 20 years, has been trying to exist by attracting evangelical students that's basically moderate evangelical students. But that's increasingly, that middle space is tougher and tougher to hold.
No, I agree. I mean, it's just like the politics have become polarized. We become much more of a bimodal distribution in many domains of society where sort of the middle ground is hard to hold. it's not a very pleasant place to be in a lot of ways because you're getting hit from both sides and you're not really getting anything for it. Yeah, that'll be interesting. My friend Nate Fisher, who went to Calvin and then also went to Harvard Law School, his point of view was basically, yeah, if Calvin doesn't hold to its distinctives as this Reformed university, why go there? Why pay to go to an overpriced, mediocre liberal arts school like everything else when there's no distinctive?
It's not a mediocre. It's an excellent education. I will say that.
Okay.
I'm a Calvin fan. I'm a Calvin alumni.
Yeah.
It's an excellent education. At least it was for me.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, it's probably not going to go. It's not going to be like ranked up there with like Williams College and some of the other.
In terms of
if your competition is other Christian colleges, then you'd say, yeah, you're really feeling good. If your competition is the Ivy League, Calvin is not going to hold as much appeal versus the more elite secular institutions.
Calvin is going to attract Christian students. That is who their market is. You can look at U.S. News and World Report rankings for Calvin. It usually ranks very, very high in the Midwest.
So, a couple other questions, just to be complete. Do you think that the idea of women's ordination is going to get pushed back on at some point? You know, if the conservatives win, if this thing goes in a more conservative direction and some liberals start leaving, is there more of a push on women's ordination?
I think there will be more of a push on one, but I don't really see it rolled back anytime soon. The conservatives know that right now they're winning because the moderates are with them. And if they really try and hold a hard line on this, they're going to lose moderates. And so I think the current position of the Christian Reformed Church, which is the local option with respect to this, I think that's probably going to hold.
Isn't it the case that there aren't very many churches with female officers?
There are, I had the numbers wrong and someone corrected me recently. The number of churches that have women senior pastors in the Christian Reformed Church is, I don't know, 10 to 12%. It's very small. Number of churches with women elders, maybe 30, 40%, women deacons, maybe 60%. But there are a number of Christian Reformed churches that don't have any women serving in office. A lot of churches, again, it's really important to remember that this is you have to understand all of these issues, not sort of just in the theological abstract, but in a context of continued aging and decline of the denomination. If a church runs out of men who can serve in office, you're going to be motivated to let more and more women into office just to fill your officers.
Yeah. I mean, when you look at the main lines, it looks to me like once you allow women pastors, it sort of becomes morally more of a characteristically female occupation. They become like more and more and more higher percentage of women over time, and kind of like happens in a lot of things that men start exiting essentially the profession. That hasn't happened necessarily in the CRC. So
no, it really hasn't. And part of what's happened here too is that when the progressives came and said, we need a local option on same-sex marriage, the Christian Reformed Church hasn't found the local option to be a very satisfying thing either. On one hand, a number of women say we feel like second-class citizens, and some of the complementarians say we feel like second-class citizens. So
you say all of the denominational offices and bureaucracy is staffed with non-complementarians, basically.
Yeah. Or at least at the highest levels, yeah.
Yeah. And I'm curious about the role of essentially activist networks within the CRC. There's a couple that were out there. There was one of a sort of a pro-LGBT group called All One Body, and then there's what I gather was a more traditionalist group called Abide. We've seen a lot of controversies about those against, like the PCA had the National Partnership, and there are these different factions who are becoming organized within these denominations to try to push it in particular directions. Did these have any real effect in the CRC, or were they major players? I'm curious about the role there.
I don't think All One Body had a lot of impact beyond Class S Grand Rapids East where it met. They tended to be, if you look at their videos, usually aging boomers and a few young people. I think Abide had a much bigger impact, not necessarily in terms of reaching out to moderates, but I think many conservatives in the denomination felt that there was absolutely, they had no voice in the establishment or the administration, and Abide sort of gave them an establishment to look to for leadership and something around which to organize. So Abide,
like a shadow government.
yeah, I think in some ways for the conservatives, but I don't really think Abide really impacted moderates a lot. I think moderates, again, for the most part, have been satisfied with the position that the denomination has had since the 70s on this matter. They look at the mainline and say, this isn't a strategy for church growth. And so they've voted with the conservatives in the last two synods very strongly.
And then I want to ask you about affinity classes. In the Reformed Church in America, they've created affinity classes. One's called the city classis, which is basically a non-geographic. An affinity classis, I would define as a non-geographic classis of sort of birds of a feather who flock together. So city classis is this group of hip, cool, very progressive churches that have kind of formed their own club. The Anglican Church in North America has affinity dioceses as a result of the amalgamation that produced it in the first place. I've heard some suggestion that that's going to be a trend in some of these other denominations. Like, we'll just resolve disputes by allowing people to sort themselves into their own sort of self-governing communities. Is that something that you think would ever be in play for the CRC?
I don't think so. Classis Minn Kota has become sort of a de facto affinity classis.
What's Minn Kota?
Minn Kota, Minnesota, and North Dakota, South Dakota.
Okay.
And basically in the Christian Reformed Church, a local church can switch classes with the approval of synod if they have a rationale. Because of women in office, some churches found it very objectionable to be in a classis where there were women office bearers. And so synod basically said, we would rather have you go to Minn Kota than leave the denomination. And so classis Minn Kota has become sort of a de facto affinity classis. But this, when the Reformed Church of America was doing this, again, the Christian Reformed Church was just always looking at the RCA and back and forth. And the Christian Reformed Church was like, this sort of breaks up the geographic nature of classes. Now, again, they allowed it with respect to two Korean classes. But again, those are Korean language. So the church has resisted it in terms of a theological distinctiveness, even though they've allowed it with respect to women in church office. They have also allowed it with respect to, say, language groups.
It sounds like there's been quite a decline in the membership of the CRC since its peak in the 90s. We're 30 years on from that, and it looks like about a 1/3 decline. You've got the boomer generation dying out. We just have different demographics in the country, so that's obviously driving some of it. We've had the rise of the nuns. But it also does sound like the CRC has had some success in attracting new non-Dutch people of various ethnic backgrounds. Do you think the CRC will continue to decline, or will it ultimately bottom out and start growing again thanks to these other factors? I'm interested just in that overall health from the population perspective.
I think there will be a bottom. I think we're going to see continual decline as the older generation grows, and I think we're going to see the loss of some churches. I think in some ways the denomination is going to be more like it was before the Second World War, coming up into the future, not in that it's sort of Dutch homogeneous, but probably more doctrinally homogeneous. That, I think, is the bigger trend. If it can start growing again, I think the church, I think in some ways, some of its growth has been taking pages from, let's say, PCA growth, because the PCA has sort of learned to grow, the Tim Keller movement and some of these things. I don't know. I don't know if the PCA is going to continue to be able to experience some of that kind of growth that saw in the 90s and aughts. I don't know if some of that is receding. So it's hard to tell. I think for a lot of these denominations, they're going to have to find a reason for being. They're going to need an identity, and it's going to have to be something that's distinctive enough to give it character, so that someone out there, and say in the menu or marketplace of denominations, would say, oh, that's what I'm looking for. One of the interesting groups in the denomination that has been growing has sort of been what I would call neo-sacramental, a little bit more like the Anglicans, but again,
That's certainly been the trend for a while
Yeah.
now in general. I think across the evangelical world,
Yeah.
more kind of like pro liturgy.
Right. So back when I came to Sacramento in the 90s, we were planting churches with seeker methodology. All of those churches that we planted now have weekly communion, higher church liturgy, all of this stuff. And so that very
Baptismal
much
regeneration.
Yeah. Well, we don't get back to that fight in the Netherlands. So yeah, that has definitely been the trend. But the United States is a big country, and even though, let's say, in a place like Sacramento and on the West Coast, things have gone very liturgical, I see in the Midwest, they're still using sort of seeker methodology for churches. So the Christian Reformed Church is really going to have to, once again, sort of find what it's about and then learn to really work on that. It inherited that from the population that affixed itself to it as Dutch immigrants, but they're really going to have to do it now as Americans and Canadians.
All right. Well, thank you. This has been great. Is there anything else you wanted to tell me that I didn't ask you about before we wrap it up? Don't feel obligated to say anything, but if I missed anything important, set me straight.
Well, anybody who watches the rest of my videos will know, I know that this is an existential crisis for the Christian Reformed Church, but and I don't know where this is all going, but in terms of the Lord's church, I think all of this kind of process is perennial. The church is always figuring its way through. And so I am optimistic about the church, even if I don't really know what's coming for my own denominational home. But Protestants sort of see these denominations as wineskins. And while I intend to stay in the Christian Reformed Church for the rest of my life, and we'll just have to see if there is one for me to stay in, or if the thing changes. And we'll see.
Well, thank you for joining. Again, Paul VanderKlay is a pastor in the Christian Reformed Church. Thank you so much for giving us a look at what's been going on there. There's lots and lots of happenings, as it were, in that denomination, and will certainly continue for some time. And again, he's got a great YouTube channel, very thoughtful stuff on a variety of topics. I guarantee you there will be at least one thing in there that you will be interested in. So check out his YouTube channel. I put a link. I'm not sophisticated enough to put one of these fancy overlays that you could just click right now. But if you go to the show notes, there is a link to his podcast channel. So be sure to check that out. Paul, thank you very much.
It's my pleasure. Good to talk to you, Aaron.